So, yes, forgot about the recording. Thank you very much, Brianne, and thank you everybody for coming. And no accident that it's women who show up to think about the future and climate. It's we know all around the world, women care more about climate and are more willing to talk about it and to do things about it. And some of that is because we care about our kids and grandchildren and weigh that more heavily than many other people do. So I'm here to talk about our roadmap to net zero, which I spent a good chunk of last year writing. It's the Climate and Environmental Plan of the Green Party of Ontario, and it's 80 pages long. And so I'm just going to be giving you a zip through it. I know that some of you are very knowledgeable, and so hopefully there'll be good questions. But I start with this. Who do you love? And particularly, are the young people that you love? I'm very fond of these two, although I have to say they're really loud and can be quite obstreperous. And why were they writing with markers on the ceiling? I just don't know. But I really care about their future. And that's one of the major reasons that I have stepped so far out of my comfort zone to run for office, because I love them. I care about them. I care about the future. I'm terrified for the future that's waiting for them. And we get all these reports that talk about 2050 this and 2050 that. Well, the young person you love, how old are they going to be in 2050? So my grandchildren will be between 28 and in their mid-30s when 2050 comes. So they'll be just at the stage when they want to, find a partner and maybe start a business, build a career, maybe think about finding a home. And they're going to be doing that in a world that is so different than the world and the chances that I had at their age. And it really horrifies me. And the more information we get from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change about what is coming, the more frightening it gets. So we've, some of you know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this, I think the largest scientific collaboration in human history, was set up by all the countries in the world to make sure that all the countries have a common factual basis with which to work on climate. And they do their major reports in cycles. We're in the 6th cycle. And this week, we got the second part of the 6th cycle report, which is what's the impact of the climate change that we have and is coming. And here are some quotes from the remarks of the UN Secretary General on Monday. It's an atlas of human suffering, not just future suffering, what is happening already right now. And we're just looking at some pictures from Australia, but anywhere in the world. Fossil fuels are choking humanity. People and the planet are getting clobbered. The vulnerable in particular are on the frog march to destruction. This is arson of our only home. The failure of leadership is criminal, and delay means death. So that's where we're headed right now. And we're getting there faster and faster and faster. And you just have to look at the newspaper to see more and more of the evidence. And the crazy thing is, it doesn't have to be this way. We still have a small and rapidly vanishing window to have a better life for ourselves and especially for these young people. And we can have some of that better life really quickly. And so that's what the roadmap to net zero is about, is how do we turn this around? Can we really turn this around without betting the planet on magic? I don't want to bet the planet on magic. So what can we do with what exists? And if I can find the forward thing. All right. So it's time to turn rage into action. We actually know what to do. We have the technology to do what we need to do. We know all the major things we need to know in order to not go down that pathway to destruction, which is where we're headed. And there's three big things. We've got to crush climate pollution, restore water and nature, and find ways to succeed together so that we don't just leave people behind. So let's talk about climate. So the first thing is that most Canadians know that climate change is happening and that it's caused by humans, but we fool ourselves. Most Canadians believe, like to pretend that Canada is a climate leader, and it couldn't be further from the truth. We are individually some of the worst climate polluters in the entire world, worse than well over 99% of the rest of the human race. And even as a country, even though we have a small population, only 38 million people, of the 200 countries in the world, we are one of the 10 or 12 absolute all-time worsts. And we're continuing to become worse and worse. We're now the worst per capita in the G7, and at a time when most of the other developed countries are reducing their emissions, we're not. So where do all of our climate pollution come from? Most of it comes from Ontario and from Alberta. Ontario's actual contribution is much worse than it shows on this chart, because this only shows the greenhouse gases, that is the climate pollution that's actually produced in Ontario. And we outsource most of our climate pollution because we buy stuff that gets made other places. And particularly if you think about fuel, we don't make any of our own fuel here. So we're buying fuel that's produced in Alberta and other places. So our actual responsibility is quite a bit greater than shows here. But you can see that we did actually get our climate pollution down in Ontario materially in a way that you don't see anywhere else. And does anybody remember how we do it? How we did it? Probably do. Anybody knows?
We got rid of coal.
We got rid of coal in our power plants, and that's what it looks like. So we were really lucky in Ontario in the way that this happened. So you can see from this chart on the left-hand side, you can see that we had quite a bit of coal to make electricity around 1990. And then we turned on the Darlington nuclear plant and Bruce. And so our coal use plunged, and you know what happened? The air got a lot cleaner fast. Now, people really didn't notice the air getting cleaner. But when there was that nuclear accident and the nuclear plants had to be turned off and the coal plants turned back up, the air got filthy fast and people really noticed. Some of you look too young to maybe remember this, but it was really in our faces because it went up so quickly. And so in 2005, we had 53 smog days in Ontario. There's nearly 1 million Ontarians with asthma. I don't know if any of your kids have asthma. Well, my late husband had asthma, and those were brutally hard days for him. Struggling to breathe is a horrifying experience. How many smog days have we had since 2015? Virtually none. Because, so the air quality was so bad in 2003 that the public was outraged. And so every party, even the Conservatives, pledged that they would get coal out of electricity, even though none of them knew how to do it. And the Liberals actually did do that. They closed the last coal-fired power plant in 2014, and we've had almost no smog since then. So that was great. But what did we do about everything else? Answer, not much. So that's really where we are today. We can crush climate pollution, though, and have better lives. And here are some of the key things that I'm going to talk about. The foundation for it all is a budget, right? So I assume that all of you manage your money with a budget. You think about how much money you've got and how long it has to last and what we have to do with it. Any government agency has to manage to a budget. But we have ignored that on climate pollution. We've pretended that the world can accept just whatever we continue to pump out. And the IPCC has said over and over again, we can't. We're running out of the world's capacity, the physical world's capacity to keep absorbing our filth. And so the critical metric that we've used for this has come repeatedly from the IPCC, saying basically this: if we wanted a 50-50 chance of a 1.5 degree world, and let's just stop there for a second and remember that a 1.5 degree world is a lot more dangerous than the world we have today. There'll be a lot more floods and heat domes and droughts and fires than now. But in a 1.5 degree world, we can expect most human and natural systems will not collapse. If we blow past 1.5, more and more human and natural systems will become brittle and fail in one way or another, many of them explosively. So would you like to have at least a 50% chance of your child or the person, that young person that you love, living in a world where most systems are not collapsing? I mean, I sure as heck would. And if we want even a 50-50 chance, which isn't a very good chance, I mean, I'd like my kids to have a much better than 50-50 chance of a livable future. But if we want even just a 50-50 chance, then we can't put into the world, into the physical world, more than 10 times what we emitted in, say, 2019, 2020, which for Ontario was 163 megatons. So we can't put more than 10 times that for the whole rest of the century and still have a 50-50 chance. So that's where we start. It's like thinking about how much space is left in a bathtub. You'll hear a lot of people talking about, oh, we're so great, we're going to have net zero by 2050. The federal government says this. But this doesn't tell you anything. It only tells you what year they're going to turn the tap off of the water going into the bathtub or the pollution going into the air. But that's not what matters. What matters is how much we put into the atmosphere. And if we keep running the tap until 2050, we're going to be way over the budget, way over the absorptive capacity of the world. So that's where we start. We've got this amount, 1,630 megatons for Ontario at most, and it's got to last for the rest of the century. How do we do that? It's not easy, but it is possible. So the first thing we have to look at is, all right, how long does the budget have to last? In the same way, if you got a financial budget, how long does it have to last? Carbon budget, how long does it have to last? So we figure we really want it to last to 2045 because there are still some technologies that are we don't have really good answers for, and it takes time to make the kind of massive transformation we're talking about. But if we want some of this budget to last to 2045, then we have to start cutting down right now so we don't use it all up too quickly. So that's what this shows you. The light green is climate pollution that comes from burning fossil fuels for energy, which is most of what we do now. The dark green is every other kind of climate pollution. So that's everything from cow burps to refrigerants to nitrous oxide from fertilizer, from the conversion of limestone and making cement. So there's all these other things which we don't have the technology for easily eliminating yet. And then the gold color is offset. So let me talk about offsets for a minute. There's a lot of talk about net zero, and there isn't a lot of talk about real zero. So this was one of the things that was a subject of protest at the Glasgow Climate Summit in November. Most of the claims about net zero are greenwashing. If you look at, for example, at the current federal government website where they talk about what do they mean by net zero? Well, they say they're going to plant lots of trees. I mean, that's great. We should plant lots of trees. Trees are fantastic, especially if you plant native trees in the right places and we look after them, but they don't permanently offset carbon. And among other things, now that we're in an era of megafires and exploding pests, we can't count on trees living 100 years, much less permanently. And so the California system is one of the most prominent. They've been handing out credits like candy for planting trees, or at least not cutting trees down. And a lot of the trees they counted as permanently sequestering carbon have already burnt and released their carbon back to the world. So there are some legitimate offsets that are likely to be permanent, at least over 100 years. I was reading something very interesting this week about some forms of steel production, making steel from slag. You may be able to put carbon into steel for a long period of time. A biochar can do it, which is important for agricultural soil, cross-laminated timber. But the cheap ones, by and large, are greenwashing. So our plan says, all right, we've got to have 90% real emission reductions here in Ontario. We actually have to reduce our emissions, not just pretend. We're still going to need some offsets because there's some things we don't know how to eliminate yet, but the offsets have to be real and they have to be permanent. And they have to be based on technology that exists and not on wishful thinking or magic wands. So what does that look like in 2045? This is what we think it looks like. Virtually all uses of fossil fuels for energy have to be gone. There's probably some uses in industry that we won't be able to replace by then, but most of them can be gone. And then the non-energy climate pollution, we figure we can cut in half. So how do we actually do all of that? I mean, what we told you so far is where do we have to go and what are the roles that the different sectors have to play, but how do we actually achieve those changes? Well, a carbon fee is a pretty basic step. We know that it's not completely indispensable, but it's a lot harder to make these changes without it, because without a carbon fee, climate pollution is free. So we would keep a carbon fee and dividend system for anything that individuals pay. And that's a start, but it isn't going to get us where we need to go. So the first thing we have to think about is where do we get our energy from? Now, in Ontario, we spend roughly $16 to $25 billion every single year just importing fossil fuels. So that's money that drains out of our economy every year. It only leaves pollution behind. And it does it again the next year and the next year and the next. And we are completely at the mercy of geopolitical unforeseen events like this week when prices go up in ways that turn people's lives and budgets upside down. We don't have to be like that. There is no reason why we should continue to be import dependent on fossil fuels. We can replace almost all the fossil fuels that we use basically with efficiency and electricity. And we can do that without new nuclear, with clean electricity, given the technology that exists today, because basically solar and wind have come down in price so far and so fast, and technology has improved so far and so fast that we can actually do all this. The toughest part will be getting transmission lines built. As we expand our electricity supply and clean it up. I mean, our electricity was very clean in 2017 when we had cap and trade. Ford's been making it quite a bit dirtier since then, but we can get back to a really clean electricity grid without too much trouble if we got at it. With that electricity, we can then electrify everything practicable, which includes a very large portion of both transportation and buildings and quite a bit of industry, and I'll show you a bit of that. We need to stop fossil fuel lock-in. We shouldn't be building new gas pipelines. This is craziness. And we should be closing dangerous ones like Line 5, which is a time bomb under the Great Lakes and one of the most dangerous places in the Great Lakes. And we need to think about the diesel-dependent communities. We have, I've lost track now, but roughly 37 off-grid communities, most of them Indigenous, who are struggling with diesel dependence, which is dirty and expensive and smelly and loud, and increasingly they can't even get the diesel in because we're losing the ice roads. So they deserve clean power, whether by through the main grid or clean microgrids. We can't leave them behind. Transportation is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario. It's driven primarily by sprawl, which also creates congestion. Did you know that we in the GTA have the worst congestion in North America? Worse than Los Angeles, worse than New York City. And it's been created pretty much deliberately by sprawl. So we've got to go almost exactly the opposite direction. We've got to stop building highways. We've got to stop sprawl. And we need to put housing within existing urban areas, which also will create enough density to support transit. We've got a separate housing policy I don't have time to go through today. In the GTA, we need to triple transit use by 2030, and we can do it. We can't do it with subways. They cost too much, they take too long, and besides, we keep putting them in dumb places like Shepherd. But we can triple transit quite inexpensively and fast by putting electric buses on dedicated bus lanes. And that also helps with the equity pieces of this, because I mean, there's a huge percentage of the population that's transit dependent, and the poorer parts of the population are more transit dependent and tend to have the worst transit. Dedicated bus lanes mean that buses can be reliable and on time and fast, and making them electric means they're non-polluting for the people behind them and for the people in them, and they're much more comfortable to ride. We need to make walking and biking much safer, which is mostly a question of providing appropriate, basically bike lanes and wider sidewalks and better crosswalks, and a design that's designed to make it safer for people and not just for trucks. So I don't know if you heard of slip lanes. You probably noticed these. There's places where instead of the sidewalk coming to a corner, the sidewalk's been cut out so that cars can turn fast without stopping. Do you know what the biggest impact of that is? You kill a lot of pedestrians. So this is just dumb design, putting cars before people. We don't need to do it, and we need to stop doing it. Electrifying heavy transit, having dirty diesel vehicles going through busy areas doesn't make any sense. And children are the most vulnerable to pollution. We have something like 7,000 transit buses in Ontario. Anybody know how many school buses we've got? 22,000 school buses. And a lot of those buses are really old and really polluting. And who do we put on them? The children with the most vulnerable lungs, who are the most likely to get cancer as a result, because the particles go deep in their lungs and stay there for a long period of time. It's just nutty. So at least the 4,000 dirtiest school buses we should electrify, and we can do that fairly quickly. So that's transport. I'm talking much too long about these things. I'll have to go faster. All right, buildings. Lots of things we need to do about buildings, and a lot of them are no-brainers. We should, of course, have a building code that designs buildings for the future that is almost upon us. And we don't. In fact, the Ford government is moving right now to put in a very weak building code, so they won't do any of these things, which is just cuckoo. Here's another thing that we know we need to stop doing. And even the International Energy Agency, which was set up specifically to make sure that Western countries got all the oil they wanted, put out their report this year saying, if we want a 50-50 chance of a stable climate, it's too late to be installing any new gas-fired stuff by 2025. There should be no more new gas-fired furnaces anywhere in the world, because that just locks in fossil fuel consumption at the time that we have to be stopping. Lots of other pieces here. One of them is about schools. So geothermal heating is really efficient and it works all year round. The geothermal industry in Ontario is still pretty basic. It needs to grow. It needs to grow sophistication. It needs more staff. It just needs to grow. So how do we get it up to launch, basically? Well, putting in geothermal at 100 schools ought to get them to the stage where they really can compete, going through the same curve that the solar and wind developers did. And schools are the best place to do it. They tend to have big areas around them. A lot of them need renovation anyway, so they're not just asphalt squares. And they tend to be old buildings with high energy needs. So there's a lot we can do to get the geothermal industry going, and that again will create jobs and businesses and expertise here. Industry, there's a lot that can be done in industry. We have a lot of really bright people in industry who are working on this already. Huge opportunities to electrify. I mean, any motor can be electric. Low-grade heat can almost always be electric. Some of the high-grade heat options can be electric. So how do we help with that? Well, certainly the higher carbon price will help. That provides a financial incentive, but then they need some help on the other side. So we've put in a multi-billion-dollar fund, which would provide some grants to help clean tech and clean transformation in existing industries, and a $4 billion climate bank, which would provide loans. Commercial loans often want somebody else's money to be in first. Banks tend to be nervous with things they haven't done before. So climate bank is really key in unlocking private capital, but it'll be lending on interest. So it'll be able to get paid back and use that to pay off. You'll see we've got green bonds to fund the climate bank. We need public procurement preferences. Again, how do we get new businesses and business models going? Well, they have to be able to sell to somebody. There has to be some initial big purchaser. This is something we saw again at the Glasgow Summit, was a number of big companies stepping forward to say, okay, we'll do that. We'll be the first to buy the green steel. We'll be the first to buy the clean vehicles. We'll be the first to buy the new pipes. Government needs to play some of that role as well. And then somebody is not on mute. So if there's somebody who's not on mute, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself, that'd be great. And then we need the federal government to bring in border carbon adjustments so that if our steel producers clean up, they don't get their lunch stolen by dirty steel being dumped into Canada. So, but that's something that only the federal government can do. Lost my cursor here. So here's a few of the things we need the federal government to do. I've already mentioned the border carbon adjustments. They also have to play a role in procurement. The federal government, you probably know, gets most of the tax money in Canada, and they buy billions of dollars worth of stuff. They could be buying cleaner materials. By the way, the TMX pipeline, which is being paid for hugely with your tax dollars, I saw a tweet this week that 58% of the steel going into that is owned by people who are close allies of Putin. So we're funding money directly into Putin and his cronies to build a terrible pipeline that's going to lose money forever at public expense. We need the federal government to put its financial support behind it, basically put its wallet where its mouth is. They've got regulatory responsibilities, and of course, they're responsible for international relations. So that's a quick run through to the climate. There's lots more details that I can't go through right now. We can't just think about climate. We also need to be thinking about water and nature, on which we are equally dependent. And again, we've seen just massive destruction during my lifetime of both water quality and quantity and nature generally across Canada, and particularly on Ontario. And here are some things that we can do with existing technology, in some cases fairly quickly. One of the key ones that got a lot of attention is our pledge of $1 billion for Indigenous climate leadership. We have an international commitment to protect natural ecosystems in 25% of Ontario by 2025 and 30% by 2030. And I can promise you we are doing damn near nothing to achieve it. But the only way we could achieve it is by working with Indigenous communities in their traditional territories and respecting Indigenous protected and conserved areas. So we've pledged $1 billion to support Indigenous climate leadership. We need to learn from them. We need their skill. We need their constitutional power. We need to also make this part of reconciliation. We need to reward climate smart farmers. Don McCabe, who used to be the president of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, was always telling me that agriculture is 10% of the problem, but could be 20% of the solution. Climate smart farmers know this. They want recognition, they want support, and they want to play their part, and they can, but they need some help. We can bring nature back in cities. There's lots of things we can do. One of the fun things is turning really small areas like parking lots into mini forests. And there's a Japanese design that's shown you really can grow healthy multi-species forests in incredibly tiny areas in just a few years in a way that is so good for everybody around it. It reduces the urban heat island effect. It reduces mental health stress. It brings back habitat. I mean, almost everybody feels happier if they can hear or see birds. It cleans the water. It provides so many benefits in even tiny areas, as well as giving a bit of a lifeline to the wild creatures we're almost driving out. And we don't need all the parking lots we have. Parking lots have been proven over and over again to be bad for the business areas they're in. And get rid of the bad and bring in a good. And we can do that again, quickly and cheaply and for the benefit of the people around it. And especially those most vulnerable who tend to live in the tree deserts in our cities. And then the third pillar of the plan is succeeding together. We have this huge divide between rich and poor, which has grown so much larger in the last 40 years in ways that really undermine social cohesion and our ability to withstand the hammer blows of climate and to make the changes that we need to make, and also just to preserve a peaceful city where you can walk around safely. So that's a big focus also of the plan: climate bonus for low-income households, paying attention to the most vulnerable in adaptation with a dedicated adaptation fund, a climate bonus, cash climate bonus for the lowest income households, but critically to give people a path into the green workforce. Lots of people tell me they would like to be part of the solutions, but they don't see a way in. Well, we can give them that. So a year of free college training and a year of guaranteed work is enough to give most people a step on the ladder. And at the very same time, the businesses that want to grow into the green economy are telling us they can't find enough trained people. Well, those two problems can be solved together, but the government has to step in at least to grease the wheels, get it going. Lots more details. I said there are 80 pages in it. One of the things is to think about, how do we measure success? We tend to do it with GDP, gross domestic product, which is just how do we turn things into money? And I'm sure you've heard this before. If you have a beautiful living forest, it's valued as nothing. If you kill it all, that's valued as money that shows up as an increase in GDP. So what we do is it methodically drives government action towards destruction, which is part of why we're moving so rapidly towards destruction. We need to go in a different direction. We need to count what matters the most and not just what is money. So what will all this take? Basically an 8% increase in the provincial budget, at least for 4 years. And this is what we would spend it on. You'll see 27% of the money goes to the Succeeding Together piece. It's a lot of money, but we need to do it. We have to do it. And it will help us achieve our other goals. And where does the money come from? A quarter of it will come from redirecting the electricity subsidies, which right now mostly go to the richest families and the most wasteful businesses. Some of the money will come from the federal government, from things they've already promised and things that are necessary to do the things they've committed us to do. A small amount of green funds to fund the climate bank. Green funds make no sense unless you have a flow of revenue to pay them back with. It's one of my problems with the NDP plan is they say they're going to borrow billions and billions of dollars in green bonds without a plan to pay it back. The climate bank will be able to pay back its bonds. There's a 1% climate surcharge on the top 10% earners. Anyway, you can see this. It's all listed there. So when we put all this together, we do know what to do, and we know what to do as individuals as well. As individuals, we can't solve the climate crisis, but we have a role. Reduce our own carbon footprint, and we need to be trying to do that at least 7% a year. We need to be getting ready to adapt to these hammer blows that are coming faster and faster. And we need to speak up, even though that doesn't feel very Canadian. We need to speak up and speak out, never get tired of talking about it. And we need to vote for climate champions. So that's where we are. It's not going to be easy, but it is going to be worth it. And if you want to help make this real, give me a hand. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a lot in a short amount of time. Very, very impressive. Thank you so much for all of that. I wonder, do you have any time for a question or two? Or?
Oh, absolutely. I'm delighted to take questions. I mean, I'll turn into a pumpkin probably in about 10 or 15 minutes, but I will try to answer as many questions as possible until then.
Yeah, so the floor is open. Yeah,
I can jump in. Thanks so much, Dianne, for such an extensive presentation. There certainly is a lot of information in there, and I need to go back and really delve into the plan more. So I was really pleased to see that you were referencing schools in a number of those slides. And so that was great to see. Just as a side note, with Andrea, who's also here on this call, we are on the Environmental Sustainability and Community Advisory Committee of the TDSB. And I happen to know that Richard Christie, whom you may know, he's doing a lot of work on trying to bring down emissions in the TDSB buildings. I did hear him say that geothermal is expensive to put in with old buildings, but whenever you have to do any new buildings, that's the opportunity to do that. And he's very excited about moving forward with that. The TDSB also has over 350 solar roofs, which is not widely known. And there are definitely people associated with that who are very interested in microgrids and expanding schools as community hubs and community energy hubs as well. So there's definitely interest in that there. But the question that I was going to come to was about education. And we're very happy to see that you're very interested in promoting training for green jobs and getting young people into the fields in which we need them to get to work. But when it comes to education in high schools, the current curriculum is woefully inadequate. So my son, who's in grade 12, he has a textbook which talks about solar energy as unreliable. So the kids going through high school right now, they're getting a lot of mixed messages. Some of the teachers, of course, are amazing and are doing their best, but the curriculum needs a serious overhaul. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Right. No, you're absolutely right, Anne. Are you familiar with the podcast Drilled?
Very familiar. And I know exactly what you're going with that. Which,
okay. Well, for everybody else, Drilled has done a fascinating and utterly horrible expose of the way the oil and gas industry has muscled its way into school textbooks and curriculums to get their message across. It's a very well-oiled propaganda machine that have been doing it for quite a long time and very effectively. When I was commissioner, the environmental commissioner of Ontario, I met with the senior management of most government ministries, including the Ministry of Education, to give them a primer on climate, on which they were, I have to say, extremely woefully ignorant, and to push them to improve climate education in schools. And I was making a little progress under Kathleen Wynne. And then, of course, well, you know what happened in 2018. So it's not an accident that the curriculum is what it is. When I think I mentioned this at the beginning, the Secretary General called out current political leadership as criminal in its indifference to the rapidly advancing crisis. And that certainly is a description that I would apply to our current provincial government.
I think you'd have a lot of people here who would agree with you on that. Yeah.
But he doesn't care about Central Toronto. They don't vote for him. He doesn't care.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I've got to let the dog in. I'll be right back. Okay. Okay. Hopefully there'll be no dog background noises, but there we are. Any other questions?
I have a question. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really great, and I'm still processing. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on housing in terms of kind of smaller houses and square footage allowances. I know in a lot of areas of Ontario, there are, I mean, Toronto, I'm sure too, but building new houses and buying houses, there's usually a square footage, a minimum square footage of like 800 square feet or something like that. I know the tiny house movement is catching on, not so much in Ontario, but just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of allowing kind of more sustainable housing, smaller housing, options for people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I mentioned, Kathy, that we have a housing policy separate from the roadmap. The housing policy came out last June. I was involved in it, but not principal author the way I was on the roadmap. But you'll see that we do put a huge emphasis on enough homes for everybody, but within existing urban areas and with a lot more flexibility for different housing forms that suit people at different stages in life. We have so many stupid rules. I mean, the parking minimums is the most obviously outrageously stupid rule that we have, which wastes a huge amount of money and space, and again, privileges driving and among other things, makes it harder to build affordable housing. So that's one of the things we would get rid of right away. I don't know off the top of my head whether we said anything specific about minimum house sizes. But certainly the general idea of more flexibility, having more people within existing dense areas, so we have enough densities to support local stores and to support transit and to support local schools. All of that will make our lives better, and as well as making housing more affordable. And at the same time, we have to be thinking about the energy efficiency of those homes and the embodied energy as we build them. So there's a lot of different factors. The Secretary General talked about climate resilient development, and that's a term we didn't use in the paper. I hadn't heard of it actually before this week, but it's the idea that we tried to achieve. So yes, we can have healthier homes and more comfortable ones. I mean, one of the things that's getting very little recognition here is the link between having a gas stove in your house and kids having asthma. It's just a risk factor we don't need to have anymore.
Okay, if there's no other questions, we will let Dianne go and have the rest of her evening. Hopefully to relax. I don't know, maybe you have another meeting.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. We do all this work, and it is only valuable if people know about it. I mean, the point of the Green Party is to show, it's very much like what I did as commissioner. And I couldn't make anybody do anything, but I could show what the facts were and what good policy should be, in the hope of moving public discourse. And that's what I'm trying to do in the Green Party as well. So thank you very much, everyone. Absolutely. If I can put in a plug, the election's in 3 months today, and who's in government really matters. So if you'd like to lend me a hand, the website's votefordyanne.ca. We are actively recruiting volunteers. So thanks very much, and give your kids an extra hug, because what's ahead for them is scary. We all have to do the best we can, and maybe we'll be able to pull this off.
Thank you so much, Dianne. Have a good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
So, hi, everybody. We are now, we have our meeting. Oh, stop recording. Hold on.